Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the 24 Hours of Pass Summit 2015 preview. You're in hour number 5, and you're here to hear Tim Mitchell's session on building better SSIS package. For those of you who haven't been to a 24 Hours of Pass before, it is a setup of 24 consecutive live webcasts that we do with different speakers from the Pass community. This session is actually a preview of one of the many sessions that will be presented at the Pass Summit in Seattle in October. And for those of you who want to keep this recording, you can get those recordings next week at the 24hoursofpass.com website. I'm Steve Wake. I'm currently president of the Denver SQL Server User Group and head organizer of the Denver SQL Saturday that's actually coming up this weekend. For those of you that will be in the Denver area, you can head to denversqlsaturday.com for info on that. And then also a BI developer at Chipotle. So those are kind of my things, but we'll move on. Now I've got just a few other slides before I turn it over to Tim. And first thing is, if you need any kind of technical assistance while you're working within the GoToMeeting application, you can actually use these the buttons that are being shown on a screen to zoom in to make it so you can see the screen correctly, and then you can use the Q&A part to ask questions, which I will actually be monitoring, and if there's anything I think that would benefit the group, I will pass them on probably more towards the end of the session after Tim has completed his part of the presentation. All of you are muted, so you won't be able to ask anything via voice. There will also be an evaluation at the end of the session, so please fill that out and let us know your feedback on how these sessions go. And we can't do these 24 hours of Pass without the support of our sponsors, so please, thank Microsoft and Idera or Microsoft, Idera, Dell Software, and we would also like to thank one of our supporting sponsors of this event, which are HP, SQL Century, and Pyramid Analytics. So without those sponsors, we can't put on these type of events. Okay, next slide. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so the other thing, of course, this is a preview of the Pass Summit for the sessions that'll be there. Both Tim and I will be presenting at the Pass Summit this year in October 27th through the 30th in Seattle. So if you would like to get $200 off the current registration, use that code that you see right there right now, 24HOP15. Will get you $200 off the current $21.95 price, but keep in mind that price is only available till the 20th, so you have 3 more days to take advantage of that before it goes up to full price after September 20th. And you can get info on that at PassSummit, PASSSummit.com is where you can get info to register for that. So some of the other things that Pass has to offer, just so that you know, you can kind of see some of the things going on there, like the local user groups that both Tim and I are involved in quite a bit. There are quite a few virtual chapters that you can attend via your own local connections, and there's lots of other free resources, including newsletters that Pass puts together once a week. So check those out along with some of the other conferences, including the Business Analytics Conference that's coming up in May of 2016, which you can find out more about at passbaconference.com to get set up to be notified about information for that conference as well. All right, so we'll turn everything over to Tim so that he has as much time as possible, and like I said, we will take questions once he's finished, and I'll answer some of them that are available within the, if you ask them now, and then others I'll save for the end. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Tim Mitchell.
All right, thanks, Steve. So in this hour, as Steve mentioned, I'm going to be talking about building better integration services packages. So this is kind of a preview on the full day pre-con that I'll be doing on Monday. I believe it's the 26th of the summit week. Registration is still open for that one. So what we're going to be covering today is it's kind of a drive-by of some of the concepts that I'll be going over in that. Just give you a few quick tips on building better integration services packages. So some of the things that we'll be talking about, we'll go through just a brief intro. There are generally, I'd like to say, either 5 or 6 facets to good package development. Reliability, resiliency, reusability, maintainability, and well-performing are the ones that I generally group together. I like to add in secure as well. Security is one of those things that a lot of folks really don't think about as far as going through setting up their SSIS environment, setting up their packages. So I like to cover that as far as being a facet of a well-designed package as well. So, pardon me, a little bit about me, and I apologize in advance, bear with me. I've got either a cold or allergies or a combination of the two. I'll do my best to stifle any audible coughing on the recording. But just a bit about me, I'm Tim Mitchell. I am a BI consultant. I've been a SQL Server MVP since 2010. You can follow me, my blog is at timmitchell.net, and for those of you who are on Twitter, you can follow me at Tim_Mitchell. Don't forget the underscore, the guy that doesn't have the underscore, I think inadvertently gets a lot of my traffic. All right, so we'll talk first about package reliability. So that's one of the key facets that we talk about. And one thing that I like to say is that reliable SSIS packages, they're kind of dull. So if you think about what a package does on a day in, day out basis, if a package is executing, it's producing no anomalies whatsoever, there's no errors, there's no warnings or nothing like that, it's actually a pretty dull event. But in the world of an SSIS developer, dull is actually pretty good. I talk about a couple of different things through the course of this presentation and through the longer presentation that I'll do at the PASS Summit. But in a lot of ways, being dull is good, because if you have, having a reliable SSIS package is sort of like having a reliable flight. You don't want any anomalies, you don't want any surprises. So that's really what we aim for, even though dull sounds, well, dull. It's actually a good thing. So when we talk about reliability and talk about trust in our packages, there's a few different things that I like to look at when I trust the SSIS packages or the ETL processes that I've built. Certainly knowing that it's completed is the cornerstone of finding out that that is a reliable process. I have to know that it did complete. I have to know how long it ran, and we'll talk a little more about that when we talk about logging. But I need to know that it was successful. Success can mean a couple of different things. Very often we look at success as, did the package succeed or did it fail? If the package actually succeeded with no errors, that's very often what we define as success, but sometimes success needs to be a bigger picture than that. Yes, the package succeeded, but did it load the number of rows that I expected? Did it run for the amount of time that I expected? So that's certainly a facet of reliability as well. And especially important is when something does go wrong. If the package fails, I or someone who's responsible and able to do troubleshooting and resolution needs to know immediately that something has gone wrong. Otherwise, if you have a package that failed and nobody knows about it, you've even got a bigger problem than the package having failed in the first place. So other things, having an audit trail. This is especially important if you're in a highly regulated environment, if you work in healthcare, if you work in finance. There are additional, and auditing is a big word, but there are additional auditing requirements above and beyond just the standard auditing in regulated environments that you have to pay attention to, not just on the application side, but specifically on the ETL side. And then any changes that have been made, you want to make sure and do. I'll talk a little bit about testing. I've got a full, I think it's a 75-minute session at the summit talking specifically about testing, regression testing, and things of that nature. And again, getting back to, even though the package has succeeded, if it's behaving differently than a prior version and it's unexpectedly behaving differently, you've got a problem even though the package didn't fail. So talking about notification, it's like if a tree falls in the forest, did it really make a sound? If a package fails and nobody knows it, did it really actually fail? The obvious answer is yes, but again, you've got a bigger problem in that you can't get out in front of a problem that you don't know exists. So creating your failure notifications, whatever that looks like. It's fairly easy to do in integration services if the package fails, either in the package or in your scheduling tool like SQL Server Agent. It's a little bit harder if you want to detect a non-failure anomaly event like a row count mismatch or something along those lines. A big part of your ETL design and the decision-making process is what represents an anomaly and how do I detect that. Things like row count transformation, where I capture the rows, doing some sort of aggregate after the load to make sure that my dollar values add up. Things like that are critical to making sure that the package actually did what I intended for it to do. And again, I mentioned the data validation. Row count match, having a row count mismatch, I like to talk about that because having a mismatched row count isn't necessarily an indicator of something gone wrong. There might be some segment of data that you simply want to discard. I hate even mentioning discarding data because there are some inherent risks in there. But if you're dealing with volatile data, that can be something valid to do. But at a minimum, you'll want to capture, if I'm discarding these rows and not loading them at all, I want to, at a minimum, have a count of those rows that I've discarded. So logging, I talk a lot about logging. It's even more dull than having a well-performing package because nobody likes to set up logging. Nobody spends their time designing or enjoying designing logging infrastructures, and certainly nobody likes reading logs. But it's critical to get this right in terms of package reliability because I have to establish what is and isn't normal. I have to know if something does fail. I have to know what it was that failed and have a clear path to fix that. Logging is really the only thing that will give me that information. So as dull and boring as it is, that is a critical piece of any reliable ETL infrastructure. So integration services actually makes it pretty easy to do logging. So for those of you who are using SSIS 2012 and above, and if you're using the catalog deployment model, it's already got logging built in. It couldn't be simpler. It's literally a drop-down list, and you select one of 4 logging options. If you're using older versions or really any version of integration services, including the new version, you've got package level logging where you can go in and on a package by package basis set up your logs, log to a text file, log to SQL Server. If you enjoy an exercise in futility, you can log to an XML file as well. But there's lots of different ways that you can do that on package level logging. The downside is you do have to set that up on a package by package basis. So if you're using SSIS 2012, I usually lean toward catalog logging as opposed to package by package logging. And obviously SSIS provides the ability to do your own custom logging as well. If you're so inclined, or if your organization has already built in some custom logging tables, that can be a better option than using the native logging. That doesn't come without some expense, some human capital to actually set that up. But if you need really, really customized logging, that's a good option. Doesn't matter what logging you use at the end of the day, as long as you're doing some measure of logging that gets you the level of information that you need to properly monitor and troubleshoot your package. That's the most important thing. All right, so we talked about reliability. Let's talk about resiliency, and this is one of my favorite topics. So building in, I've talked a lot in the past about building bullet-resistant integration services packages, and when I talk about that, I like to ask people to think about what would happen right now if some error or anomaly condition were to occur in your most critical, your biggest SSIS package or ETL process. Does it simply continue executing in spite of the error? Do you have any sort of graceful failure process that will allow it to clean up whatever mess it might have made or roll back data that was partially loaded? Those undo processes, there are several of them that you can build into integration services, and we'll talk about those in just a second. And also notification, as I talked about last time. In the event of either a failure or an anomaly event that's simply handled in line, you still want to have some sort of notification, even if all you do is log it. You have to have some sort of notification to make sure that the appropriate people are aware of that. So this is a quote from me, and you can quote me on this. Every process that you build will eventually fail. And if you look at every single SSIS package that you develop, assuming that, well, maybe it will fail, or maybe this particular task will fail, or maybe this particular component will encounter a bad row of data, just exterminate the word if from your vocabulary when you talk about that. It will fail at some point. So depending on how critical that package is, you'll want to build in routines that will account for that failure. Some packages, say a staging package, for example, you would not have to spend as much time worrying about handling errors because a staging package by nature, you're going to rerun it. It's probably going to truncate and then reload those staging tables if they're volatile staging tables. If you're loading, say, a financial transaction table, it's a whole different story because the worst thing you can do is have a partial load where you've loaded part of your data but not all of your data, and then your table's left in an inconsistent state. So if you're using integration services, it does have a number of pieces that make that process quite a bit easier. So on the control flow side, you can use precedence constraints. You've got event handlers that you can use that will make that easier, where you can, I like to say that you can capture or track errors. I sometimes fall in the trap to say that you can handle an error, but I don't want to say handle an error in that it will by default capture and not allow the error to continue. Because on the control flow, if you're using your precedence constraints, by default your package will still fail unless you override it to not fail. Sorry about that. So on the data flow side, pardon me, you can handle data not just at the task level, but on a row-by-row basis as well. So if you've got data that's coming in, part of your data is good and part of your data is bad, and you want to account for scenarios like truncation issues, like if you've got a lookup table where you expect that some of your data will not have a match in the lookup table, the data flow has provisions for that as well. Pardon me. Sorry about all the coughing. In addition, logging is a key part of that. So you want to make sure that any error that you capture, especially if you trap the error and don't let it bubble up and don't let it fail the package, you have to log that. And any conversation that we have about resiliency would also include restartability. So there are tools and integration services that will allow you to provision for package restartability, specifically if you're using checkpoints and integration services. That will allow you to build your package where if you have an error anywhere in your package, it will start not from the beginning, but next time it runs, it will start where that error occurred. Pardon me. All right, so the different design patterns, and I briefly mentioned these a little bit earlier. So the default design pattern for handling errors is simply to allow the package to fail. So if you don't do anything else, your package will fail, it will stop executing, there won't be any sort of rollback routine, and nothing else will be executed beyond that. Sometimes that's appropriate. As I mentioned earlier, the scenario in which you're using a staging package, for example, and you're loading a set of volatile staging tables. Having just a simple, I call it a dumb failure pattern where it doesn't do anything to account for a failure. Very often that can be appropriate for those because my remediation is when I correct the error, I'm simply going to go back and run that volatile staging load, which will truncate the target tables and reload them. So don't hear me saying that a dumb failure pattern is bad. Very often that's the best way to go. But do be aware that it's not the only way to go if you have other data scenarios like failing gracefully. This is my default go-to pattern where if I have any sort of critical process, it's not a volatile process that I can arbitrarily rerun over and over again. I like to have some provision to allow me to fail that package gracefully. So certainly I want to log the errors. More than likely I'm going to do a notification. And if I'm doing something like I mentioned earlier, where I'm loading a table with transactions, and these are all financial transactions, I can't leave that in an inconsistent state. I've dealt quite a bit with financial data and financial folks over the years, and if I've learned one thing, financial folks are really picky about the numbers matching up. And it's better for me if I'm the ETL architect and I'm delivering to them a message about the system readiness. It's a much easier sell to tell them we had a failure in the package last night, but it rolled back and your data is correct, but it's correct as of yesterday. That's an easier sell than, well, we had a failure and the data is completely wrong because you have half of today's data that was loaded. So very often in a case like that, undoing from that partial load is a more appropriate approach. And again, especially with audited data, with financial data, it's a much easier sell to say that you've got that data was rolled back as opposed to having inconsistent data and incorrect data in your target table. Sometimes it's appropriate to encompass or absorb or vacuum up, if you will, an error within a package and let the package continue running. So think of a case where if you're a nationwide company, you're bringing in flat files from various outlets, various retail outlets across the country, and they send in those flat files whenever they do their daily close. Well, you might have different points in time or different times of the day where they're sending those over, and you don't want to, well, you want to have your ETL running, but you don't want a single failure. You don't want a single missing file to break the rest of your ETL. So in a case like that, you can allow that one process or that one file load to fail. Again, log the failure, but let the rest of the ETL continue without failure and just flag that one as having not executed. So on the control flow, I talked about precedence constraints. You can couple those with an expression if you choose, and that makes it even more powerful, and you can have more complex conditions that you're looking for. Things like event handlers, if you want to, I fall into the trap of calling these error handlers, and they're not really error handlers because they'll handle errors, they'll handle on pre-execute, on post-execute. There are a number of conditions that your event handlers will handle. Now, in most cases, you are handling an on-error event, possibly an on-warning event. So the vast majority of use cases for those are exception conditions, but do be aware that they don't just handle errors, but other conditions as well. And note that neither one of these, by default, will keep your package from failing. So if I have a control flow and I've got a task A attached to task B is set to fire only if task A fails. Even if when task A fails and B is successfully executed upon that failure, by default that will still bubble up and cause the package to fail. There is a workaround for that, or there is I don't call it a workaround because it's not really a bug, but there is an alternative approach that will allow you to prevent that package from failing in a condition like that. And that setting is propagation. So if you override the propagation property, it will, in most scenarios, and I want to emphasize most, it will prevent that error from bubbling up to the parent container or to the package. The exception to that rule is if you're using propagation across multiple packages, and I turn off propagation in a child package and I execute that from a parent, it will still fail the parent package. It's a little bit of counterintuitive behavior, but once you know it's there, it is useful. So on the data flow side, you can use data flow tools to either avoid or capture errors before they even occur. Pardon me. So using the lookup transformation is one of the key ways that I like to prevent errors from or prevent errors from occurring in the first place. So if I'm looking up a list of cities, a list of states, a list of employees or products, and inserting that into my target table would cause a foreign key constraint or violate the foreign key constraint. If that wasn't found in the lookup table, I can simply use a lookup transformation, avoid that error altogether, and for any unmatched data, I can redirect that either out to an error file or out to a triage table and not have the error at all. For most of your sources and destinations and your transformations, many of your transformations as well, you do have an error output. So within your source destination transformation, if you encounter a truncation error, if you're trying to insert data and you do hit a foreign key violation, you can redirect that data out to a different output, out to as I mentioned earlier, a triage table or a flat file containing error data. One thing to pay attention to is that integration services on the data flow by default wants to handle data on a buffer by buffer basis. So be aware that unless you override it, that error will, in most cases, if you're talking about a relational database operation, you would be redirecting not a row by row, but a buffer by buffer operation. So you want to make sure, pardon me, and account for that whenever you're building in your error handling and your error capture routines. All right, so we talked about resiliency. Let's talk about reusability. So I've written a rule. You can find the description of it on my website, but Mitchell's Law is never write the same code twice. So I find this a lot in not just ETL patterns, but source code patterns across the board, T-SQL, C#, and otherwise. You've got a lot of code, and I'm guilty of this, having done this myself back before I wrote the law. Of having essentially multiple copies of the same logic. It's easier at the time to say, well, I'm going to copy this function, I'm going to copy this UDF, this package, this piece of a package or whatever, and just drop it in. But in the vast majority of cases, it's actually easier to reuse that copy of the code. And integration services is no different, especially if you're using 2012 and above using the catalog deployment model. It's much, much easier to engage reusability in those components in 2012 and 14. So some of the design patterns, certainly parent and child structures. We could spend an entire hour just talking about how parent and child packages interact with each other, but this certainly supports reusability, again, especially in the later versions where parameterization is used, SSIS parameters are used. Expressions are infinitely usable in integration services for making those pieces more dynamic, hopefully keeping away from having multiple copies or similar copies of the same logic. Think of a case like this where if you're writing out to a flat file and you want to name that file according to whatever the date is, you could do that statically by saying, here's my March 1st file, here's my March 2nd file, and so on. Or you can use an expression and make that property dynamic. Same thing with parameterization. I can externalize as much of that logic as possible, pass in the parameters that I want to use, and make that a much more reusable pattern. Some of the other tools, I'll go more into depth on these whenever we get into the pre-con at the PASS Summit, but the SSIS catalog and the use of environments to supply parameter values makes the reusability story a lot easier in 2012 and 14. And ultimately, we want to avoid those hard-coded connection strings, hard-coded path to a file, directory listing, any static values that we're using. We want to avoid that because that takes away from our ability to reuse that package. So if you see a package that I've developed, even if it's a really small SSIS package, you're going to see a lot of parameters, you're going to see a lot of variables, because I want to be able to reuse that as much as possible. That's a much easier design pattern, even though it's got more moving parts because of all the parameterization and environments and variables. It does make for easier code maintenance because I've got exactly one place to go to maintain that code. In that pattern, generally speaking, one package will do exactly one thing. The first package I ever developed was this huge behemoth of a package, 5 megs in XML data alone. And it took forever for me to, just firing it up and doing all the validation took forever. And it took a while to realize that breaking that up into smaller packages, while it means more actual moving parts or more packages, it's actually an easier design pattern to support, and certainly from a reusability perspective. The pieces that I'm doing over and over again in that same package, I could have a parent package calling a child package and make that a more reusable pattern. So we can't talk about reusability without talking about incremental loads. So that's sort of reusing code and reusing data. So think about if you're loading a 10,000 row table. There's probably no harm in truncating and reloading that every time, but if you're loading a million, 100 million, billion, multi-billion row table, truncating and reloading every time just doesn't make a lot of sense. So from a data consistency perspective, from a performance perspective, it makes a lot of sense to reuse the data that you've already got there and only update the data that's either inserted, updated, or deleted. So several different methods in and around integration services exist for that. And some of these that I mentioned, they're not specifically SSIS. That's intentional because I'm a big fan of using the right tool for the right job, and sometimes using, say, an SSIS data flow is the best option for something like this. Very often it's not. Very often the database engine can supply that functionality better. So things like change tracking, change data capture are database engine pieces, but very often they're useful in integration services as well. Things like row hashing, tracking the insert, update, delete date on a row, and sometimes just going in the data flow, brute force column by column detection to find out what's changed. That's my least favorite, but it also has the fewest assumptions as well if you're doing that directly in SSIS. All right, let's talk a little bit about maintainability. So the goal with maintainability is being kind to your fellow developers and frankly to yourself as well. So we've all asked this question. We see this code. Who wrote this code? This is terrible code. I don't even know what it does. There's actually a pretty funny comic out there that talks about different structures in your code that you find that you maintain. But too often, the answer to the question, who wrote this code, is that it was me. And if I wrote code, there's code that I looked at even 6 months, as short as 6 months after the code was published, and I look at the code and think, first of all, who wrote this stuff? and then I realize that was me. The second question I wonder is, what was I thinking when I wrote this code? There's no documentation, there's no notes, the naming convention doesn't lend itself to understanding what the purpose of this is, so I end up not maintaining the code necessarily, but just trying to decipher what historical me from 6 months ago was thinking when I wrote this code. That's the goal of maintainability, is to avoid situations like that where there's any ambiguity in anything that you've written in the code. Integration services makes it actually pretty easy to do things like documentation and doing inline notes on your packages. So as an SSIS developer who's made that mistake, I can't offer any excuses. So there's no excuse for that. It's just far too easy to do documentation, and that gets us to the next point, which is documentation. Yes, it's a dirty D word. Nobody likes to do documentation. Documentation is slightly more fun than worrying about logging and building a logging infrastructure, but it's still pretty dull. Documentation is also what makes us more effective developers. So in particular, I don't know how many of you work as a consultant, but I do. I purely do consulting work these days. And back when I was a full-time employee, it was easier to get away with not doing documentation, because if 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road, if a question comes up, if the code needs to have some troubleshooting or enhancements, the person who's going to be doing that is this guy. So I didn't necessarily have to worry as much about documentation. But I fell into the trap at the same time of not worrying about documentation because it was easy to forget about, because I could always educate myself on what I really meant when I was writing that code. The downside is that's always harder than you think. So yes, it is dull. It doesn't build new features. Documentation doesn't build new features. So none of us really enjoy doing that, I think. But it is necessary to make sure that I have a maintainable package infrastructure. It's really, really easy in integration services. Annotations directly in the package will allow me to do that. Almost every task and component has some sort of a description field apart from the name that will allow you to do that. So if you're using annotations, if you're using the description fields, not only do you have a good layout of the purpose of everything, but in fact the description fields will give you a tooltip if you hover over it in the designer. So that's a really useful tool. One quick reference, you can always use the Package Explorer and integration services to look into the pieces that are involved in that. I always like to talk about having good naming conventions, and having a good naming convention, and I believe I've got a slide with a link to that. There's an old post by a guy named Jamie Thompson. I shouldn't say old and refer to Jamie Thompson. It's a historic post by a guy I respect named Jamie Thompson, who several years back put out a post on SSIS naming conventions, and this is largely the standard that integration services developers use for naming their components and their tasks and their components on the data flow. So that's one thing that I recommend for documentation. It's really easy to do. You're already giving the thing a name, so you might as well use a standard naming convention for data flows, for your SQL tasks, for your sources and destinations and things like that. It doesn't matter that you follow Jamie Thompson's naming convention or my naming convention, as long as you're consistent, as long as you're using your consistent naming convention, whatever that turns out to be. That's the most important concern there. So externally, pardon me, documenting your packages. I hate to say there's a lot of manual work that has to go into that. You can document your package inside the package itself. This data flow does X, this SQL task does Y, but there still needs to be some sort of external documentation that's largely going to be maintained manually. If I'm an SSIS developer, yeah, I can open up the SSIS package and see what it does, kind of infer what's going on there. But if I'm a business user, if I'm a CIO, that's not really something that I'm going to be willing to do, and open up that package and browse through something that I really don't understand. So having external documentation is critical. There are some third-party tools that will help you with that. So things like, I think Pragmatic Works has one. There's several tools that will allow you to automatically generate documentation based on package metadata. It'll tell you the what, it won't tell you the why. So that's why I always refer back to some manual component of documentation will always be required. All right, so let's talk a little bit about BIML. So in the theme of maintainability, I always ask, why edit a package? when you can simply regenerate it. If you've not had any exposure to BIML, I'll talk more about BIML when we get into the pre-con next month. But BIML will allow you to quickly generate a large number of packages based on a pattern-based approach. So I've quite literally generated hundreds of packages after I wrote my BIML code, generated hundreds of packages in about 15 seconds once I've got my pattern established. BIML is a really good tool. To get started, it's completely free. If you're already using BID's helper for whatever version you're using, you've already got access to BIML. You can very easily get started with BIML and create just a simple package infrastructure, or it can be as complicated or as large as you need it to be. Again, I've done this with hundreds of packages, and it works phenomenally well. So you can build that. You can look at, in fact, I've got a demo that I'll show once we get into the pre-con that dips into AdventureWorks, pulls out all the existing metadata, and builds out a set of about 100 packages based on existing tables and views in there. I don't do any additional mapping. It will automatically build those packages for me. You can also use an external source to target mapping and build out your packages that way. That's the more common use in my experience, because business users want to say field X in the source needs to match the field Y in the destination. And it's a little more work to do it that way because you have to set up in advance that source to target mapping, but it's also extremely powerful and allows you full control over where that data is flowing. So this is not a silver bullet. I don't want to say that BIML will solve every problem. I'm a big fan of it, but in cases where you have a similar pattern where you're doing an ODS dump from your transactional system and not doing a lot of transformation, if you've got an environment that has a lot of ETL changes and you're having to open up a lot of packages, tweak some metadata and close them out, certainly that could be a good use of BIML. And you have to take into account how your local folks, your local staff, or you, if it's you developing the BIML script, is able to support that. If you've got some familiarity with either C# or VB scripting, and you don't mind getting your knuckles bloody on some XML work, BIML can be a good option for you to look at. All right, let's talk a little bit about performance. So package performance very often can be critical, but I always like to ask this question. Is performance really a concern? Before you go down chasing the rabbit trail on troubleshooting performance on a package, is it really an issue? And here's why I ask. I rolled off a client not too long ago that had a process that would run for about 30 minutes. I know that with some effort, with maybe a day or two of effort, I could make some tweaks in the package, I could make some tweaks in the source and the target databases, and I could cut that time down by probably a third, maybe even less. But here's the thing. They run that package in the middle of the night, one time a month. Now, I could have done some troubleshooting on that, and I could have made that thing run in 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 3 minutes maybe. But there wouldn't be a ton of business value for that, and especially as a consultant, given that for every hour that I spend, really, I have to justify the business value for that. Sometimes it's not an appropriate course of action. So first question you have to ask is, do I really need to spend time on this and figure out if I can improve performance? If the answer is yes, is integration services really the problem? Very often it's not. Very often it's I've got a slow source, I've got a slow destination, and you can tweak SSIS all you want. If you're pulling in data across a slow link from the internet, or if you're loading across the ocean, for example, you're loading a billion rows of data from your Dallas office to your London office, that's not going to, SSIS is largely not going to be your bottleneck. You're going to have some other bottlenecks there. So assuming that it is an integration services problem, you have to identify which piece is causing the issue. And that's often the tricky part, especially if it's a data flow operation, because it's not inherently easy to track down, well, I've got a fast source, but a slow transformation and a fast destination. It does take a little bit of work to get to that point. Back to logging, you have to know what's normal. If your package normally runs for an hour and it ran for 8 hours last night, logging is the only thing that will tell you that. Certainly capture runtime, row counts as well. So from a performance perspective, if your load ran 10 times what it normally did, but all of a sudden you have an influx of 10 times as much data, that's an easy answer to that question, but only logging will tell you the answer. So just a few things that we'll talk about in more depth in the pre-con. Know how lookups, your lookup transformations can impact how your data flows across in your data flows. So the lookup cache mode is the biggest factor of that. There's 3 different modes. Full is the default, partial and none are the other options. The full cache will take the entire content of whatever lookup table you point to. First thing it will do is dump it into integration services memory before it does any other operation. That can be useful, and that's the most common operation, but if you've got a billion-row lookup table, probably not the best option to do. Partial cache, it's still doing a row-by-row lookup, but every time it encounters a new value, it will store it in the SSIS memory cache. And the new cache has a fairly limited set of use cases, but it doesn't cache anything at all. You're making a round trip to the server every time. The only case that I can imagine for this is if you're accounting for late arriving dimensions in a data warehouse load or something along those lines. But otherwise, you're losing the opportunity to have any of that information cached in memory. A couple of other things that we'll cover in more depth. Using that table drop-down list, it's really, really convenient to do that. I get an instant list of, if I'm connecting to AdventureWorks, these are the 87 or whatever tables that are in AdventureWorks, and I grab the one that I need. 2 problems with that. First of all, you're doing a select star, and very often you don't need all those columns. If you introduce additional columns into your SSIS data flow, that means more memory. So try to avoid that. Use, instead of your table drop-down list, use your selection window and type that in. Because the second downside of that is it does an open row set to get the metadata. That's not really a huge issue if you're talking about a well-designed table, but if you've got a view, or especially like a view calling a view, that could be just doing that open row set just to get the metadata could be an expensive operation. So get rid of that table drop-down list and type in your query. Yeah, it's a little more work, but in most cases it will perform better as well. And that can be a reminder as well to use that where clause. If you only want yesterday's records, or you only want active employees, for example, that can be a good reminder to use that information. So on your data flow, every transformation is categorized as non-blocking, partially blocking, or fully blocking, and that describes how they hold buffers as data flows through. So know those blocking transform, the properties of the blocking transforms. The easiest ones are on blocking. It's simply, as soon as data comes in, they're sending it out the other side. They're processing it. It's a bucket brigade, and I don't hold my bucket. I'm passing the bucket along as quickly as I can. Things like the row count, the direct column transformation, and the conditional split. You wouldn't think the conditional split is one because you're branching data off and saying, this data goes here and this data goes here, and I'm creating 2 different buffers. It's actually creating a virtual copy of that, so it doesn't physically split that data. So those are totally non-blocking, don't hold any buffers whatsoever. Merge, join, and the union all are examples of partially blocking transformations where they can hold buckets of data as needed. Think of the merge, join, and that's not a common transformation, but the merge, join expects to have sorted input on both sides, and it will hold both sides of that until it gets the data. I include the lookup transformation in this as well. Technically, it's not a blocking or not a partially blocking transformation. Technically speaking, it's non-blocking, but used in the default configuration, the first thing the lookup transformation will do is grab all your metadata, all the data that you need for that lookup, or I said metadata, all of the data, load that into SSIS memory before it processes a single row of data. So technically it's not partially blocking, but I like to bucket that into partially blocking because it will pause the whole package before it loads anything until it gets its data. Fully blocking, this is a stop sign. It's a red light. Things like sort, aggregate, fuzzy, fuzzy grouping, fuzzy lookup are all fully blocking transformations. So I don't want you to hear me saying that blocking or partially blocking transformations are bad. Every tool has a purpose. If you need to do sorting operations and you're pulling in, say, text data or XML data, you can't do that in the sort. You have to do it either in the data flow or after you've loaded it to the database. So sometimes using those are okay, but do be aware of the performance impact. Other things that just have a tendency to be slow, my favorite, slowly changing dimension wizard, which is a fine tool if you're loading a slowly changing dimension of states in the U.S. But if you're Amazon.com and you're loading your product list, that thing simply does not scale. It's okay for small loads. It's terrible for any sort of scale at all. Same thing with the OLDB command. It's a useful transformation for doing updates and expiring records, but it is a row-by-row operation. So not an evil tool, like I mentioned earlier, but do be aware of its performance implications. So there are some workarounds for things like that. Native, some third-party, I don't like to recommend a ton of third-party add-ins, but if you've got performance issues, very often there are things, I think Pragmatics has got some stuff, Cozy Rock has got some stuff that it is a commercial product, but at the same time it can avoid some of those other expensive operations. And sometimes non-SSIS options can be useful as well. I'm a big fan of the T-SQL merge statement for doing slowly changing dimensions. So just because you're using integration services doesn't mean you can't drop down and do database engine functions as well, like the merge statement. All right, so last up, security. Let's talk a little bit about package security, how you can secure the catalog and the different pieces that are involved in that. So package protection level is the most visible piece. This will allow me, if I've got, say, an FTP password, I can encrypt that information in my package or opt not to save that at all. The default setting is encrypt sensitive with user key. That's, in my opinion, one of the worst options that you can have, because if I have a package that I'm working on, I save an FTP password, I pass it off to another developer, they'll have to, every time they're going to have to type that password for the connection in. And it's a little sneaky in the way that it works, in that it doesn't tell me that I share that with somebody else, that they can't encrypt that, and they get a weird cannot decrypt XML node warning whenever they open that up. My favorite is to use don't save sensitive, where it doesn't save any of that sensitive information like FTP passwords or SQL login passwords, but you have to have somebody either type it in manually or, even better, have an external feed like a parameter or like an SSIS environment that will feed that into you. But that does help make sure that you don't have plain text FTP passwords, for example, in your package. So if you're using SSIS 2012 and 14 and you're using project deployment mode, also known as catalog deployment mode, you can use secure parameters. You can mark each parameter as either being sensitive or not sensitive. And if you mark it as being sensitive, it will encrypt that according to the settings that you set on the last thing that I mentioned, on the package protection level. So if I'm encrypting a password just for me, then if I open that back up by default, I will still have visibility that have that password, but someone else that opens that package would have to type that in, because they can't, with their credentials, they can't decrypt that. So it applies to your variables in your SSIS environment. Do know that if you're using environments to supply parameter values, your sensitivity setting must match. I can't pass in a non-sensitive parameter into a sensitive parameter value. Those settings do actually have to match when you're using the catalog for execution. So that's at this point, that takes care of the package execution. And I got a message from Steve. It looks like my audio audio is not good. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my webcam, just in case that is the issue there. Maybe that will make our audio a little bit better. Steve, let me know if that doesn't improve. So that discusses the package settings, the package protection settings itself. Let's talk about the execution of the package. So if you're executing the package and you need to execute it as a different user. So for example, if I want to execute as me, then if I'm running it from the designer, that's implied. It's already going to use my credentials. If I want to execute as a proxy account, as a defined user, if I want to execute as the SQL Server agent account, I do need to be aware of the context of what account is executing that whenever I run that package. So the account that executes that is critical, because I have to have the appropriate database permissions. On the file system, I need to have, if I'm accessing either reading from or writing to a file, I have to have access to do those operations. And whatever I'm using for notification, whether it's mail or some other mechanism, the account that I'm using has to be loaded to that as well. It has to be accessible from that as well. Proxy accounts, I'm a big fan of using proxy accounts in security in SQL Server or SSIS, because I can explicitly say this is the execution account that I'm using. It doesn't require that I give up that I'm executing it using my credentials, because my account might have more access to things that I don't necessarily want my ETL having access to. The proxy account will use the SQL Server credential object, and I can set that up and run it, especially if I'm talking about doing a SQL Server agent execution. It's a really easy thing. It's actually a two-step process to set up, but it's a very easy thing to set up. And then on the catalog itself, catalog security or securing packages on SQL Server in older versions was more difficult because it was really broad. You had just a couple of groups that you could put people into, and you didn't really have granular control over package by package or project by project what someone had access to. It's much better in the current version in that if I'm using the catalog, it's more like a Windows access control list where I can say user by user or group by group, I'm going to define who has access to do what and so on. And it is a scriptable operation, so I can use T-SQL to establish those security settings as well as to update those if I need to update those. So we don't have to use the database roles anymore specifically for catalog security. And as I mentioned, you can set that at the user or the group level. I can give someone access to edit a package. I can give them only execute permission where they can only execute the package, or I can grant them basically full control, which will let them manage all the permissions throughout. All right, so that covers our drive-by on building better SSIS packages. This is the part where I get to talk about myself in the third person. So Tim will be presenting this material at the PASS Summit. So I'm actually doing, as I mentioned at the outset, a full-day pre-con on Monday the 26th. Registration is still open for that one. I'm going to go more deeply into these. This was certainly a drive-by. We're going to go much more deeply into the 6 facets that I discussed here. I've got lots and lots of demos that we'll be going over. And then on Friday of that week, I'll also be going over, it's a shorter session, it's a 75-minute session, but I'll be talking about testing your SSIS packages, doing data validation testing, auditing, regression testing, and things like that. So I certainly appreciate your time and attention. I do want to open it up if there are any questions that came in that we can answer before we wrap up here.
Yeah, we did have a couple, and one that people have been asking, and I don't know how it's with 24 hours of pass. They're asking if your slides are going to be available separately, or is it just going to be the video? I don't know if you were going to put them up on your blog or anything like that.
Yeah, so I'm almost certain on the link, and I don't know if Vicky's still on. She could probably answer that. But if they're not available there, I can put it on my website for them to download. But I'm almost certain it was available on that download as well.
Okay. Yeah, actually, Vicky just put a comment into the chat saying that you could download them from the link she put in there. So those of you that were looking for that. So let's see, technical questions. So one is a BIML question, which I'm sure you'll like. So I'll try to read this here. It's kind of long, but I frequently receive data sets containing 40 to 400 CSV files, which have different fields each time. Currently use the SQL import and export wizard and set it to suggest data types based on the first 10,000 rows. I then have it save the SSIS package so I can use it later if needed. Can something like this be automated on a group of files versus doing each manually?
So the short answer is that yes, you can handle packages in bulk like that using BIML, and it's going to be a whole lot easier using BIML as opposed to going package by package. But on the flip side, automating that where it at runtime automatically detects what metadata there is and loads whatever data you have in there, that's not nearly as easy simply because SSIS is highly bound to the metadata that it has. So if I'm dealing with, in particular, a data flow, it's going to defer to the existing data flow metadata that was set up at design time and not runtime. Now there are a more complex answer, and I'll try to keep it brief since I know we probably have some more questions, but a more complex answer is that there are some ways to handle varying metadata in integration services, but it gets very complicated in a hurry.
Yep, I agree. So I've had a couple people asking about the link to Jamie Thompson's naming conventions, which I was actually looking up on my
Yeah, I
own. If
should.
there was an
I
easy
thought I'd have that
search.
in my. Yeah, I intended to put that in my notes, but now that we're into the presentation, I see that that it's not in there. If you can't find that for whatever reason, if you search on Jamie Thompson SSIS naming convention, I'm
Yep.
guessing that's probably the first result that you'll get. If you can't
Yes.
find that, go to my website at timmitchell.net. Send me a contact. I've got a contact me form. Send me a note, and I'll send you a link to that.
Yeah, a bunch of people are posting those in the questions, but let me send the responses out. Here is the link, and I'll send it to all, so everybody will get that link. Because yeah,
Awesome.
it's on SQL Blog.
And as I mentioned, using the one that Jamie uses, I use kind of a modified copy of Jamie's. The important thing is not necessarily to use someone's specific naming convention, but use a consistent naming convention strategy,
Yes.
whatever that looks like.
Consistency is definitely key. I
Absolutely.
agree. Okay, so and the only other one is what you would recommend using instead of union all, since it is a fully blocking transform.
No, so union all is actually just a partially blocking,
partially blocking.
and I included that in the partially blocking list just as an academic exercise more than anything. I've seen no performance impact in terms of the union all transformation. The merge join is another story because it does require, it will routinely hold buffers that come in from the left side and the right side because it does require both inputs to be sorted. But on the union all, even though it's technically categorized as a partially blocking, I've not seen, I don't know that I know of a case where it would hold those buffers of data to any appreciable level, to any level that would cause performance issues.
Okay, great. All right, you can move on to one of the last slides there. So thanks everybody for attending Tim's Building Better SSIS Packages. Thanks again to Tim and his expertise. We'd like to again thank our presenting sponsors, which are Microsoft, Adira, and Dell Software, and our supporting sponsors, which are Pyramid Analytics, SQL Century, and HP. We hope you got something out of this. Please follow along on Twitter at Pass24HOP and use that as a hashtag along with SQL Pass on Twitter as well. So stay tuned next for Peniel Dave's 7 Tips to Performance Tuning, Optimization, and Everything. Thanks very much, everybody.
All right, thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone for attending. And I'll hopefully get to see you at the summit. If you have any questions for me in the meantime, don't hesitate to let me know. Tim@timmitchell.net is my email address.
Great.